Hi, everyone here in the three-dimensional world and everybody on Zoom. Welcome to the Jordan Center. Welcome to NYU, Department of Russian Slavic Studies. We are thrilled to have with us today Professor Yuliya Ilchuk from Stanford University. Ilchuk is an associate professor, congratulations, of Slavic languages and literature at Stanford, trained at the University of Southern California and at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. She focuses on cultural exchange, interaction, and borrowing between Russia and Ukraine. Her first book, which I'm sure you heard of, Nikolai Gogol, Performing Hybrid Identity, 2021, reveals the ambivalence and hybridity of Gogol's texts, situating them in the in-between space of Russian and Ukrainian cultures. The book has won several prizes, including the 2022 University of Southern California Book Prize in Literary and Cultural Studies for Outstanding Monograph, published on Russia, Eastern Europe, or Eurasia in the fields of literary and cultural studies. And Ilchuk's new book project, which is tentatively titled The Vanished, Memory, Temporality, Identity in Post-Euromaidan Ukraine, unless it's changed since then. This book also draws on theories of hybridity, and it's aimed at understanding socio-cultural responses to the war in Eastern Ukraine, and we'll certainly be interested to hear more about that too. So thank you very much, Yuliya. Welcome.
Thank you, Anne and Sasha, for inviting me and giving this opportunity to present my book for the first time. I just realized that I have many more up-to-date topics, but it was important that I formally introduce my project. So why hybridity in the time when this word completely compromised itself? I think that it still remains a useful analytical framework, although uneasy to talk about the status of Russian language literature created by the writers of Ukrainian origin from very early modern period until nowadays. In one very real sense, the current invasion of Russia and Ukraine is about language, about the right of Ukrainian people to defend it together as its statehood, culture. And if we argue that the country has always had a strong tradition of Russophone literature, in the time of the war, it may give Putin another reason to talk about genocide of the Russian-speaking population. But I still believe that hybridity should stay with us to understand the complex history of colonial relationship between Russia and its subjects. But I think that the shift should be made from the idea of identity to the understanding of identity as a set of speech acts. So the theoretical framework of my study, informed by a concept of hybridity and mimicry, is developed in a kind of moderate trend in postcolonial studies by Robert Young and Homi Bhabha. The term borrowed from the natural sciences, hybridity, originally referred to natural intermingling and mixing between two or more people, and later it received broad application in the social sciences. Contrary to classical colonial theory, Edward Said, who clearly distinguished between the colonized and colonized, Bhabha and other theoreticians consider the reciprocal effect of the colonized and colonized during the colonial encounter. Bhabha's concept of the third space of enunciation positions hybridity as a transformative side within which the colonized and colonized are presented with new possibilities to describe the identity of self and the other, and to invent new forms of political agency and subversion. In the protracted colonial situation, as Ukraine experienced throughout several centuries, when open political struggle is practically impossible, language adopts indirect tactics of evasion and camouflage. These tactics were successfully used by many Ukrainian intellectuals who created and negotiated their identities in the Russian Empire. The Russophone literature written from Skovoroda, Narezhnyi, Somov, Kostomarov, and Bakvitka, Kulish, and Shevchenko are completely different phenomena. Since in one case, the Russian language texts were the artistic expression of the innate bilingualism, while in others, like Shevchenko and Kulish, the political act of writing in the situation when any Ukrainian writing was impossible. And in many other cases, the Russian language narrative persona revealed some extra textual practices, some kind of mode of self-construction and self-fashioning. So the hybrid identities and language brings up the question of a subtle, implicit resistance to imperial homogenization. Nikolai Gogol's hybrid language captured writing in between two cultures by producing double-voiced dialogic discourse that delivered completely different historical messages to the metropolitan Russian and colonial Ukrainian audiences. The concept of hybridity has its origin in Mikhail Bakhtin's term heteroglosia, that the scholar discerned in the discursive multivocality, разноречивость of Gogol's Ukrainian tales. For Bakhtin, Gogol was a pursuer who crossed languages, border back and forth to narrate Ukrainian culture to an imperial audience. The metaphor of in-betweenness may seem synonymous to hybridity, but there are some nuanced differences between the two. The in-betweenness better conveys a meaning of openness and flexibility and features uncertainty, fluidity, temporal and spatial restlessness. So if hybridity refers to a single mix in which the entities are combined and boundaries are blurred, in-betweenness additionally has the idea of interlingual relations that allows for coexistence of multiple entities. I also use hybridity to undermine the essentialist approach to the identity formation and further the constructionist view of cultural identity. Trying to negotiate his identity on the borderline of two languages and cultures, Gogol and his contemporary Ukrainian writers developed uniquely dialectical worldview and heightened sensitivity to flux and transition. The generation of Ukrainians before Gogol took an active part in building their imperial institutions. Some of them adopted an all-Russian, общерусский type of identity. Others maintained their original Little Russian, малороссийская identity. For the most part of the 18th century, this dual identification of Ukrainians as Little Russian and All Russians was a common practice due to the weakness of the Russian nation-building project itself. The Ukrainian regionalism was even encouraged by the imperial governments as long as it helped boost the formation of a long-desired public sphere. The Russian imperial authorities could work with the Ukrainian elite on terms of mutual collaboration and benefit because they wanted to expedite the absorption and assimilation of the newly acquired territories of the former hetmanate into the empire. However, this period of cooperation didn't last long, and soon regional distinctiveness became a mark of potential disloyalty to the empire. The collaboration of the Ukrainian intellectuals with imperial authorities began with Stefan Prokopovich, rector of Kievan Academy during the hetmanate, and later a leading imperial ideologist during the reign of Peter I. In his sermons, Prokopovich coined the term All-Russian Emperor and promoted the idea of loyalty to the empire, which became paramount in recruiting the Ukrainian Cossack elite into imperial services. Being himself a man of multiple political affiliations, Prokopovich managed to appeal to a broad stratum of society, urging Ukrainians to show loyalty to the emperor. Through his sermons and speeches, he appealed to the Ukrainian audience to join the new imperial fatherland. Contemporary historians still disagree on whether the former Cossack elite understood fatherland, or rather patria, this is the word was used in Latin, in the imperial sense that Prokopovich tried to invest in it. For the descendants of the Cossack Starshina, loyalty to the patria, fatherland, had remained palpable even after the subjugation of the hetmanate, but the borders of the patria expanded in the late 18th century, and Ukrainians were slowly coming to terms with new reality. Ukrainians could maintain both identities, a privilege that no other minority in the empire enjoyed. With the introduction of Russification policies by Catherine II, the situation began to change. Most of the Ukrainian nobility lost its former social privileges since it became harder to register patents required to obtain an imperial title. In practical terms, this meant that Ukrainian gentry could no longer send their offspring to the imperial capital to pursue state and military careers. Thus, the Russification of the Ukrainian elite began. Imperial practices of pragmatic tolerance and cooperation with Ukrainians gave way to an attitude of superiority toward them, and Ukrainians began losing their political power in the center. From the late 18th century onward, they were slowly assimilated as Russian imperial subjects. The scale of Russification of Ukrainians can be corroborated by the commentary of Nikolai Gogol. In his 1822 review of Bantysh-Kamensky history of Little Russia, he pondered over the question whether the Russian Empire succeeded to assimilate Ukrainians. While recognizing the imperial administration's success in integrating the landlords in its social structures, Polevoi claimed that the empire failed to colonize Ukrainian folk. We treated Ukrainians like conquerors treat colonized lands. We Russianized the aristocracy, gradually replaced local rights with our own laws and customs, eliminated the most reluctant recalcitrant, and we ourselves mixed with the alien common people, Germans, but failed to Russianize them. They, Ukrainians, do not and cannot have political independence, but again, they are ours, but not us. So it's significant that Polevoi finishes his review with almost Homo Baba's definition of hybridity, saying that Ukrainians became us, but not white. One of the strong yet invisible vehicle to resistance of homogenization by the empire was multilinguality of Ukrainian intellectuals. Starting with 17th century Ukrainian philosophers and grammarians, bilingualism, multilingualism became very real among the educated elite. So they discern etymological connection between Slavic words and their counterparts in Church Slavonic, classical languages, Hebrew, and modern European languages, and practice multi-discursive writing. Miletis Matritsky, for instance, he cataloged numerous morphosyntactic forms peculiar to vernacular Ukrainian side by side with the written Slaveno-Rossiyski language forms in order to reinforce Ukrainians' connection with living speech. In Ivan Uzhevich, Grammatica Slavenskaya, published in 1643, Church Slavonic and Ukrainian were treated as two variants of one and the same language. The next generation of Ukrainian writers, Kotlyarsky and later Narezhnyi, Gogol, and Vitka Snevyanenko, continued to mix languages, but not as systematically as the previous generation, and mostly for the sake of comical portrayal of Russified Ukrainian bureaucrats. These writers broadened the notion of modern little language based on the synthesis of various regional forms of the Russian language, an idea which was in opposition to the perceived purity of the Russian imperial language, as well as to the artificiality of the bookish Yazычia practice in Western Ukrainian land Galicia. The popular use of this hybrid language signaled the unequal inter-ethnic and interlinguistic relations between Russian and Ukrainian languages, but at the same time, it united these Russified Ukrainians in the community of hybrid language speakers. So when Gogol's first collection of short stories, Evenings on the Farm near Dikanka, was published in 1831-32, it amazed the Russian audience not only with its exotic Ukrainian folklore, but also with the idiosyncratic Russian language. The Russian writer and lexicographer Vladimir Dahl described the stunning effect that language produced on him in terms of mixed delight and criticism. Greedily, you swallow up the whole story to the end. Then you read it again, and still you do not notice that he is writing in wild language. You try pedantically to figure it out, and you see that one absolutely shouldn't write or talk like this. You try to correct it, you spoil it. You cannot touch a word. What if he would write in Russian? Что если бы он писал по-русски? So Vladimir Dahl's question has intrigued me, and my study of Gogol's hybrid language started by examining his bilingualism as a serious theoretical question. Gogol's language proficiency was developed in the bilingual environment of left bank Ukraine after the incorporation of the hetmanate as a Little Russian governorate into Russian Empire. Ukrainian landowners became increasingly Russianized, but they continued to use Ukrainian in the private sphere, which naturally led to non-symmetrical diglossia. Functional diglossia was also typical of the Russian cultural situation in the early 19th century. The Russian literary elite commonly used French as a formal language for correspondence and society talk. However, the bilingualism of native Russian writers was essentially different from that of their Ukrainian peers. And this difference was in the value and prestige of the second language. The additive bilingualism of the Russian elite developed because both languages, Russian and French, were considered equally valued and useful. The bilingualism of the Ukrainian gentry created an obstacle to the assimilation into Russian society. For them, Russian was associated with high language variety, which carried cultural and social capital and gradually superseded Ukrainian in all social spheres. For educated Ukrainians who were competent in 4 or 5 languages, or at least trilingual, fluent in Czech Slavonic, vernacular Ukrainian, and Russian, multiple language proficiency helped them develop an acute feeling through the inner form of the word. As a bilingual, Gogol was subject to a complex cognitive operation while mastering Russian. His early letters and early drafts of evenings on the farm near Dikanika exhibit several types of hybrid elements resulting from Ukrainian phonological spelling patterns. It's no strange that Gogol felt himself as a foreigner once he moved to St. Petersburg in 1828. He entered Russian literary culture as one who was challenged to overcome the difference between his own Ukrainian variant of Russian and the Russian language of the Petersburg elite. In one of his early letters, he confessed to his mom, "If my work is ever to be published, it will be in a foreign language. And I need to be even more precise in order that I not distort the characteristic nouns of the nation with incorrect naming." So how should we understand the foreign language in Gogol's own self-definition of the relationship with Russian? I would say both literally and figuratively. Literally because Gogol was bilingual, spoke Ukrainian with his servants and wrote at least one letter in Ukrainian to Boleslav Zaleski, one of the Polish exilic intellectual. But most importantly, he violated all literary conventions and enriched Russian literary language with various heterogeneous elements. In the same way as Franz Kafka destabilized the norms of German and created his own minor language, Gogol created his own Ukrainianized variant of Russian that truncated its usage on a semantic, syntactic, and stylistic level. The tension occurred not between major Russian and minor Ukrainian, but between the normative use of Russian and what Gogol's hybrid language made of it. This dehumanizing effect of the hybrid language produced on the colonial Ukrainian subject is played out in one of the tales from Evenings, Christmas Eve. The protagonist, blacksmith Vakula, is preparing to join the Zaporožian Cossacks in their meeting with Empress Catherine II, and trying to show off their proficiency in Russian. Vakula and the Cossack, they corrupt Russian language to the extent that it becomes pidginized. So this is, I preserved the original orthography just for you to understand what I mean by pidgin. Что ж, земляк, сказал при осане запорожец, и желая показать, что он может говорить и по-русски, что большой город. Кузнец и себе не хотел осрамиться и показаться новичком, при том же, как имели случай видеть выше всего, он знал и сам грамотный язык. Губерния знатна, отвечал он равнодушно. Нечего сказать, домы большущие, картины висят скрозь важные, многие домы исписаны буквами из сусального золота до чрезвычайности. Нечего сказать, чудная пропорция. So in Vakula's distorted Russian, Gogol mocks Ukrainians' attempts to use Russian as a means of self-affirmation to become members of the imperial elite. He defamiliarizes Russian and makes it sound as odd and amusing to Ukrainians as Ukrainian sounds to many Russians. This episode figures as partial presence of the Ukrainian subject within the dominant language. Vakula, and by extension Gogol's Ukrainian inflected Russian, demonstrates that language is not only a means of communication, but also a channel through which social identity comes to life. Social actors, especially those marginalized and subjugated, do not necessarily consent to become native speakers of the imperial language. Sometimes they struggle to master the dominant language, impedes learning literacy in general. From this perspective, colonial speakers of their own and of imperial languages face not only affective and cognitive challenges in mastering both languages equally, but also ideological dilemmas of allegiance, competence, and authenticity. Thus, literary language practices used by hybrid subjects like Gogol become strategies of self-assertion and distinction. Similar function of the strategic use of the language myth is exhibited in Taras Bulba by Yankel, Jewish intermediator between Poles and Ukrainian Cossacks. Throughout the tale, Yankel intersperses his Russian with Ukrainianisms and Polonicism in order to demonstrate his complete assimilation into the community. At the same time, the speech of other Jewish characters, whom Taras meets in Warsaw, is presented as foreign and incomprehensible, quote, and is unmarked graphically. Peculiar Ukrainian and Polish expressions are inserted in Yankel's speech and to underscore his intermediary status among the Orthodox Cossacks and Catholic Poles. Trying to persuade Taras that he is not the Cossacks' enemy, Yankel uses Ukrainianisms. We have never yet hobnobbed, snuffivались with the enemy. And as for the Catholics, we want nothing to do with them. May the devil visit them in their dreams. To us, all Zaporozhians are like our very own brothers. The expression, may the devil visit them in their dreams, pust im черт приснится, is a literal translation of the Ukrainian idiom, хай насниться им лысый дідько, which Gogol used in the letter to Polish exilic intellectual Zaleski, written entirely in Ukrainian. So when describing the state of the Poles and besiege Dubno, Yankel uses Polish expressions. Dali Bóg, я не знал. I swear to God, in Polish. Yankel, switching to all linguistic codes, is paralleled by his fluid perception of the border between us and them, because he is caught between Orthodox and Catholics and must camouflage himself in order to survive. When pretending to be a Pole while escorting Taras in Warsaw, Yankel asks for entry into a Polish prison, repeating, it is us, это мы, свои, 4 times. Ukrainian hybrid forms were still present in Gogol's writing as late as 1840s, despite his conscious effort to conform to Russian norms. This shows the enigmatic ways in which one's first acquired language has a protracted effect on speakers during their entire life. His language experiments demonstrate how he appropriated language for concrete artistic purposes. If in the Ukrainian tales written in 1830s, Ukrainianism and hybrid forms were used to reproduce the heterogeneous soundscape of the Ukrainian village, in his so-called Russian tales, Dead Souls and Selected Passages, the combination of high and low registers mixed with professional jargon and archaisms expanded the idea of the normative literary language. In his rather unsystematic but creative use of hybrid forms, Gogol echoed the endeavors of previous Ukrainian literature to create an interlanguage that would be comprehensible to all social strata of the Russian Empire. I will return to this table to explain the digital part of my project. So I want to return again to the idea of in-betweenness, межа языков, that sounds like synonymous to idea of hybridity, but it's more specifically emphasizes the constant crossing the border. Throughout his literary career, Gogol's language had a strong performative potential. It was an act of doing language. Comprising several idiolacts, Gogol's literary language was a wholly coded structure in which Ukrainianisms and idiolacts form one pattern of reference for Russian audience and another pattern for Ukrainian ones. Gogol existed in this linguistic continuum between Ukrainian and Russian and enriched Russian culture with heteroglossia, which, according to Bakhtin, saved Russian literature from being too serious, rigidly regulated and ritualized by the state. It's significant that Gogol's hybrid discourse provided Bakhtin with the material for his pioneering theory of heteroglossia and later polyphony. In the 1935 version of Discourse in the novel, Bakhtin mentioned only one aspect of heteroglossia, многоязычие, multi-languageness, which signaled the internal conflict stemming from the presence, quote, of alien speech in a foreign language, чужая речь на чужом языке. Later, in revisions of this work, heteroglossia began to signify the in-betweenness, межа языков. Both laughter and heteroglossia discussed as preconditions of the emergence of the genre of novel originate, according to Bakhtin, in Gogol's prosaic heteroglossia. In his analysis of Gogol's Ukrainian tales, Bakhtin identified devices and features similar to those he found in Rabelais' medieval Canola's discourse. One of them, Gogol's style, is present in the nonsensical verbal play. Bakhtin illustrates this verbal absurdity with a Ukrainian proverbial idiom, в огороде бузина, в Києві дядька. There is an elder bush in the garden and an uncle in Kyiv. So just two incompatible things put together. Initiated by Rabelais in the medieval burlesque tradition, this deliberate verbal nonsense, нарочитая словесная бессмыслица, constituted the cornerstone of Gogol's poetics. It destabilized the semantic, logical, and spatial temporal connection between words. Gogol's creative language undermined habitual relationship and norms and gave a temporary break from all stable semantic connections, and thus necessitated the construction of the new world. Bakhtin considered Gogol's mixing of discourses a crucial stage in the formation of the novel and truly transnational phenomenon, which subverted all previous national traditions and created the very idea of modern literature. Heteroglossia and polyphony are often viewed by Bakhtin scholars as other languageness or many voicedness. However, in Bakhtin's initial theorization, the former concept meant the presence of another national language in the discourse of the dominant language, and was explicitly applied to Gogol's use of Ukrainian in Russian. In Bakhtin's later theorization, it was transformed from cross-language to an intra-linguistic phenomenon that signaled the coexistence of several socio-ideological languages, but not necessarily foreign languages within one national language. So the important stage in the process of hybrid language formation was the internal stratification of the national language into socio-ideological discourse through penetration of dialects and sociolects into it. Therefore, the heterogeneity of Russian literary language resulted from the contest between different dialects, among which Ukrainian language played a crucial role. During Romanticism, heteroglossia brought many mixed language phenomena into literary prose and activated double voicedness of discourse by appealing to two or more speakers and expressing two or more intentions. Gogol was only one of many cases of this transition from Russified Ukrainian to a more national-oriented identity. All Ukrainian intellectuals of Gogol's time were engaged in complex identification with both imperial and national cultural modes. Since hybridity takes on different balance when it's studied on the individual or social level, only a dual perspective can prevent us from viewing Ukrainian intellectuals as those who unconditionally internalize colonial self-representation as inferior ethnic other. In all previous research on Gogol, this model of internalization as a sly Ukrainian has dominated. It inferred that Gogol assimilated others' objectification and made it part of his own subjective reality. However, this sly Ukrainian model of identity was a projection of Russian society's expectations. If viewed as strategic and positional, Gogol's hybridity was not exclusively circumscribed by external influences. His identity was a subject of constant reconsideration and change. It developed through ambivalent and transgressive moments and escaped identification in either-or categories. The focus on the performative aspect of hybridity offers a more nuanced perspective on Gogol's text and language, which calls into question the essentialism prevalent in much of Gogol's studies. The synthesis of cultures and ethnicities in Gogol's text produced difference without assuming a hierarchy among imperial, national, and regional cultures. But comparing and juxtaposing Gogol's different redactions of his text in my book, I wanted to unpack the complexities of his language and identity. Interpreting Gogol revised text is both methodological and theoretical problem, because the external reasons for making changes in the early version of his text were often inseparable from the internal changes. On the one hand, the prescriptive regulations of 19th century imperial ideology assigned linguistically correct norm, condemning all hybrid elements as contamination. Under the banner of regulating Gogol's language, editorial practices were essentially in the service of protecting Russian national identity, But on the other hand, Gogol himself was preoccupied with refining his literary language and style, which with each new edition resulted in textualization of his identity. The ability to produce a new text was facilitated by internalization of revision and change. Gogol always revised his text to refine his language style, but he did so with the goal of improving his own personality. This can be interpreted as prioritizing the procedural means over the textual ends. He wanted to produce a better text, so he kept revising it, so he could produce a better self. Revising became a habit of his soul. At one moment, he would restore Ukrainian expressions, and the other one replaced with more up-to-date Russian expressions. In social terms, revision of a text operates as a social interaction. Anticipating responses of the audience, the writer creates a textualized tension between intention and socialization. Both imply recursive processes of alteration and reconsideration. Thus, revisioning became part of the structure of Gogol's thought. It implied the incompleteness of the self, as well as conscious effort to become a better, fuller person. So I also tested the idea of Gogol's language hybridity with computer-assisted methods. This is the corpus of all writers who wrote in Gogol's lifetime, both from Russian side and Russophone Ukrainians. So this is all text written by Ukrainian intellectuals, Shevchenko including in the Russian language. So in order to understand this in-betweenness, I created a corpus of all works of prose fiction written in Russian, either by Ukrainian or Russian writers. And performed the digital methods to situate the corpus on the scale. So this graph shows Gogol's works literally located in between the Russian and Ukrainian traditions and equally close to those of the Russian, Ukrainian and Polish writers in the database, which reinforces my argument of his cultural and language hybridity. It would be an oversimplification to present postcolonial hybridity as a space of harmonious existence devoid of power, of tension and competition. However, the hybrid performative language of Gogol and of other Ukrainian intellectuals of the period gave the culture a strong jolt toward innovation, openness, and cultural change. Barriers were crossed and aesthetic tastes modernized, which moderated the polarization and dichotomization of Ukrainian society into us and them. Until nowadays, the centers, both in Russia and Ukraine, keep defining the national codes in strict ethnic linguistic categories, showing little interest toward regional identification and hybrid cultures and languages. This situation can be rectified only with advancement of postcolonial and decolonial studies within the Slavic field. A strong school of postcolonial and decolonial criticism hasn't yet developed in the post-Soviet republics for different reasons. The two major trends in studying Gogol in Russia, Gogol, Orthodox Gogol scholarship, православное гоголеведение, and the liberal Gogol scholarship. The former scholars engaged in canonizing Gogol as a staunch monarchist and Orthodox Christian, an approach articulated by Russian scholar Voropayev and editor-in-chief of complete works of Gogol published in 2009. Voropayev has claimed that there is only one aspect of writer's works and personality worth studying, the Orthodox one, taken from the Gospel. In Gogol scholarship, this criterion can best open Gogol up to readers, can help them comprehend their own lives and the spiritual path of Russia and solidify their faith. The so-called liberal Gogol scholarship apply various methods: psychoanalytical, lingua-poetic, literary, historical, comparative, to analyze Gogol's text and context. Since the independence of post-Soviet republics, scholars present their studies at the annual conference, Readings of Gogol, Gogolskие чтения in Moscow, and publish them in its proceedings. And during recent years, more and more emphasis has been placed on Gogol's embeddedness in European and Slavic tradition, resulting in proliferation of metaphors concerning the center versus periphery, or west versus east. This view of the Russian cultural field generally presupposes a version of history that locates the empire or Europe at the center of modern history, It rejects the culture and history of native people as worth studying on their own terms and downgrades them to the realm of folklore and myth. That the general negative attitude to the Russian Empire's colonial past and appropriation of literature of its ethnic minorities as Russian provides a sanitized version of Russian culture and of Gogol as a paragon of the Orthodox tradition. Enriching Gogol's scholarship with a postcolonial approach and decolonial thinking may reinscribe the tradition in a way that is productive for the present and beneficial for the future, revaluing what the empire devalued in the process of annihilating the differences. In Ukrainian literary scholarship, this dominant tendency is an anti-colonial reading of Gogol, which identifies the colonizer with Russian culture and views Gogol as a secret agent, undermining the imperial center. The danger of this anti-colonial nationalist approach to Gogol is in labeling everything associated with imperial culture as oppressive and in presenting the relationship between Russian and Ukrainian cultures in binary oppositions. It's important to demarcate post-colonial from colonial and anti-colonial. Anti-colonialism cannot be a productive strategy because it doesn't account for the significant cultural, religious, and lingual diversity in Ukraine. It doesn't transcend the claims of both imperial and nationalists to embrace such transnational phenomena as border literature, hybrid identity, culture in between. Elements of hybridity, marginality, or the little Russian complex have often defined in Ukrainian cultures as scourges. It seems that some Gogol scholars in Ukraine have tried to assume the official normative power of certain ideology, imposing their own national cultural values in place of the former colonial canon and reversing previous imperial reading practices. The natural reason for this is an anti-colonial resistance to Russia's military aggression in Ukraine. Nevertheless, the study of Gogol's hybridity can provide an alternative way of resisting cultural and political domination of Russia. The annexation of Crimea and invasion of Ukraine took place under the banner of protecting the rights of the Russophone population. If Ukrainian academics were to embrace the in-between cultural phenomena as part of their own culture, there would be fewer arguments for Putin's Russia to interfere in Ukraine's affairs. Recently, Ukrainian scholar Nikolai Gogol and the Russophone Ukrainian writer Andrei Kurkov have talked about an urgent need to include literature created in Russian by Ukrainian writers in the rubrics of Ukrainian culture. Gogol has emphasized that Ukrainian culture created in Russia was not merely a minority culture within the Russian, but eventually Soviet empires. It was and still remains to a certain degree a sort of diaspora culture. Andrei Kurkov has proposed a more radical measure for reappropriating the Ukrainian version of the Russian language to establish an academic institute of the Russian language of the Russophone diaspora of Ukraine, which would study and protect the cultural heritage created in that language as part of Ukrainian culture. I think that establishing the status of Russophone literary tradition as diasporic in Ukraine could serve as a vehicle of ideological and political resistance to the anti-colonial discourse produced in and transmitted from Putin's Russia. Thank you.
Yuliya, thank you so much for that incredibly thought-provoking talk. We're going to open it up to questions. I certainly have many questions if I'm allowed to start. Maybe I will start. So as we think about post-colonial approaches, where do you think we are best off looking? With what other literary traditions and scholarly traditions do you think we can mine the most that's valuable? Because post-colonial studies is huge and you're going to get a different view of it depending on where you look. I know that the parallel between the Russian imperial situation and, say, the UK has been made often, the parallel between Ukraine and the Celtic periphery. Are there other places you think we should be looking?
I still, I remain a scholar of Slavic and Eastern European cultures, and I would look at trends in Czech and other West Slavic cultures, including also the Galician Ukraine. So already during Gogol's time, his Taras Bulba was translated by Russkaya Tritsa Russian Trinity. It was a group of intellectuals in Galicia that used so-called Южно-русский язык. And when you look, you actually have this edition in New York Public Library. I once traveled to find it and read it. It's just a peculiar hybrid idiom. And they use this Южно-русский язык as an antidote to Polish dominance. So all this kind of in-between phenomenon would better correspond to what was Russophone Ukrainian writers trying to do. Because, the differences between Celtic and English are too big, right, to show the same kind of tension between related languages.
Right.
So this development of different hybrid idioms were happening not only among popular writing, like the narrator from the people, right, that use the vernacular form, like Rudy Panko. Why Gogol became so popular? Because everyone spoke like this, but nobody dared to write like this. So this trends to create this inter-language, right, that would unite the growing reading public. It was an attempt of our Eastern, Slavic people to come to terms with their distinctiveness. Another parallel would be used if you look at Belarusian national tradition. So nowadays, for example, Trostyanka, the hybrid form, right, is being treated as a national idiom. Although Trostyanka has the same status as surjik in Ukrainian, it just looked upon, so it's not literally norm, right? So it's but it's the only mode of the existence of literature in the national language. So I would say that this hybrid idiom was a kind of transitional phenomenon of small East Slavic nations that's trying to come to terms with their national identity.
Thank you. That's very useful, because it's true. If you're looking at postcolonial studies in Latin America, say, people are writing Spanish largely, and there's not this issue of almost like interlanguage formation that you're describing.
Also, Ukrainians were more educated and had better opportunities, educational opportunities earlier, right? So we cannot put their competence in these languages in post-colonial terms, because they all had equal status, right?
Thank you.
Thank you. I have so many questions. That was fantastically interesting. I'll leave myself to two. The first one was about also post-colonial theory use and in-betweenness. I would ask like how in-betweenness and social class in terms of the use of the language work together. Because I look at this example you brought from Christmas Eve, because clearly for me, because of the lexic that used like class-based Russian language kind of goes for more high class in terms of the description. So, but it was just my random guess, so I'd like to learn more. The second question is about like the final part of your talk when you discussed like Gogol studies and where it's all going. Like, what are the main changes you see with Gogol in contemporary Russian society? And maybe you can predict something, well, within like academic world and also beyond, like mass culture, because I was just thinking, of course, you remember it better. Recently, yes, there were like horror movies based on Gogol, like I'm not sure if the production was Russian or Ukrainian or mixed, like what's going to happen?
I will probably start with the second half of the question. So right before the bicentennial anniversary of Gogol, 2008, I think it was the last time when Russian and Ukrainian Gogol scholars met together at the conference titled "Как нам поделить Гоголя?" How shall we divide Gogol? And it was quite symptomatic, because since late 2000, right, if you look at the conferences, and I usually check the publications in Gogolyevsky Dom, most of the research by Russian scholars are being done in Gogol's so-called Russian tales, Revizor, Мертвые души, and tales, the Peterburgsky повести, whereas Ukrainian Gogol scholars, they try to, they are organized around Gogoloznavчі студії, edited and published by Pavlo Michet and Nisha. So the topics of their publication mostly about finding the subtexts in Gogol's Ukrainian tales. So I feel like this kind of agreed division continues. So they still perceive two Gogols as a real methodological problem, and they divided him. I think it's natural, and with the use of digital methods, we can argue that there are no stylistic differences between Taras Bulba, let's say, in selected passages. If you use stylometric analysis, if you look at the frequencies and collocations, but this is the reality. So they just negotiated this agreement. With the popularization of Gogol's texts, I think it started much earlier. In the 1960s, a lot of Ukrainian nationalist directors used Пропавшая грамота. I don't remember, it's Elenka's film or someone's. So they were part of the dissident group that were looking for safe material for popularizing the idea of national culture. And the recent production of Taras Bulba and V, it's hard to comment on the adaptation when it's funded by the state. So, right, and very often it's not, it's by the state kind of commission. So that's why I'm not sure whether it reflects real sentiment, right, real region. But if you look at the political discourse, Putin is a fan of quoting Gogol and all of his public speeches. I remember last year, right after the invasion, there was a concert on Narezhnyi to the annexation of Crimea, and he misused the quote from Taras Bulba, что такое товарищество? Нет уз священного товарищества. So Gogol is becoming a political weapon in both cultures, and I feel like as scholars we should be aware of this tension, but still produce a scholarship that remains unbiased. The first question about how hybrid language marked the transition in terms of class, right? So we have very few historical demographic data, but I rely on the data that Sergei Blokhy mentioned, that before the reforms of Catherine, abolition of hetmanate, there were twice more educated professional Ukrainians. I mean, doctors, lawyers, clerks in general than those of Russian origin. Again, because Cossack starshины, Cossack elites had resources to send their offspring to get education abroad. So this how it happened before the absorption by the Russian Empire. And Gogol's Ukrainian tales, the Вечера, take place 50 years. So it's like distant past, but past that still remained in the collective memory of the community. So one of the moments that I didn't include in the slide, that Vakula understands that they know how to speak grammatnes, but they use language strategically. They want to pretend, because Catherine propagated this idea of Ukrainian nation as a singing and dancing tribe, right? Танцующее, поющее племя. So they knew that this is their expectations of the Russian imperial society, of them to play this mask of sly Ukrainians, and they perform this language. But in reality, of course, you know, the Gogol was not the only one who suffered from the reform of table ranks. They lost a lot of former landlords lost their title in the empire, and he had. This is the one of the reasons why he became a writer, because he had to start from the very low rank. And he became bored in the state office. So the problem was real, that they were downgraded class, and they had to try their hands in other professions, creative professions. Yeah, but of course, the hybrid language is being used as upward or downward social movements by many diasporic communities. Like Jewish immigrants, they had to downgrade because they were too educated when they moved to New York. They created a number of manuals, right, how to address the society to pass as their own people. So yes, language always used strategically as a method to fit in.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question in the Zoom from Olga Merson. Olga, would you like to, I see your little hand there, would you like to say your question out loud?
Yes, there's a whole bunch of them, but the most intriguing one to me is at the moment is about Prokopovich, who manipulated language towards, on the one hand, extolling the empire and actually kind of licking the ass of Peter. But he manipulated the hybridity of language precisely, except probably not with Ukrainian per se. He called Peter the anointed one, Pomazanic, in the original Greek, which was Christos. So he came to the point that is quite shocking about it. He sort of carried it absurdum. But the question that I have is, would you say that he contributed to the eventual and very, soon to come, his imperial rhetoric rather contributed to the congealment of imperial oppression in general in the Russian Empire, and the specific discrimination against the Ukrainian elites that you mentioned earlier, because you were talking it's a very interesting approach. You were talking about the hybridity of language as a reaction to the policies of Russian Empire. But I was wondering if Prokopovich's personal linguistic policies might have been a cause to some of the congealment of this mentality. So he fascinates me very specifically. I guess this is, I have a couple of comments, but this is my real question. How do you hold his linguistic policies? Is he responsible for some of the things you are describing as problematic, or what's going on there?
Thank you, Olga. It stimulates me to do more research in pre-Gogol time of use of language strategically. I used Prokopovich's example just to show you that being in translation was a kind of a natural condition for Ukrainian educated elites, and Prokopovich appealed to the concepts, political concepts known of allegiance and patria, known from Polish Commonwealth, right? But invested a different meaning into these concepts. And this created this peculiar phenomenon when it's becoming lost in translation. This is one of the arguments that Tatiana Yakovleva uses in her book Incorporation. So she studies the Pereyaslav Union Agreement as a language document, and trying to show that the Talmachi, the translators, interpreters from Muscovite Tsar, they misinterpreted a lot of terms, including wolność, that existed in the Polish Commonwealth, and Ukrainians invested a different meaning. So Prokopovich has actually made Ukrainians visible in the empire, and thanks to him, a lot of ministers with Borodka and Kochupey found their place in the high rank position. So I define this period as kind of very favorable and positive for Ukrainian diaspora. The changes started long after Prokopovich's death, and I need to study other stages from what was happening between early 18th century and later 18th century. So basically, I want to say just I need to do more research to give you more competent answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Olga, maybe we can come back to you in a minute because I see that Mila Fyodorova also has a question in the chat. Mila writes, how do you interpret the fact that Putin is even closer to Ukrainian writers on your scheme than Gogol is? How do you distinguish the low registers of Russian from Ukrainianisms? Because obviously not all these colloquialisms are Ukrainianisms.
The colloquialisms from which episode?
I'm not sure. Mila, are you hearing us? I think she was referring to the chart and thinking about colloquialisms generally and how you towed it
Yes, it's from Ночь перед Рождеством,
Uh-huh.
the quote that has already been mentioned, Снюх.
Снюхивались. Не, снюхивались это из Тараса Бульба. Это Янкеля. Okay, so I'll start with the principal component analysis that I used to illustrate Gogol's in-betweenness. Of course, you know, the digital methods, it's a black box of data. It cannot be used as an independent study. It can only accompany our close reading analysis. I deliberately selected only prose fiction texts that were created as a process of translating the Western European models. Right? Gogol himself, he borrowed either Hoffmanesque tradition or Mérimée tradition. So I think the analysis selects the correlation between the words, not on the paragraph level, but on the sentence level. So in terms of stylometry, this is the this graph shows the most frequently used words combined next to each other. So the fact that Pushkin is closer to Gogol only just shows that they were contemporary to each other and creating the same novelistic tradition. So the examples that from the episodes of Vakula, it's actually the pidginization of language, right? So they're not examples of colloquialism. It's just the phonetic rendering of Russian pronunciation, Balshushi. So nobody uses in the written language this. But in my book lens analysis, I refer to more specific examples of calking from languages. When Gogol translates literally the idiom from Ukrainian into Russian, темно, хоть в око стрель, one of the most interesting example. In Ukrainian, you would say темно, хоть око, темно, хоть око выколи. So he basically takes two idiomatic expressions in Russian and Ukrainian and combines them in one category. Yeah, at the time when the language was not codified, maybe some of these examples would be claimed as a colloquial use of Russian language. And we need to look at a more broader picture of what this colloquial phrases represent in the text, right? Rather than just the separate linguistic elements. So this is I wanted to say that it's more pragmatics of language rather than poetics or stylistics.
Thank you, Yuliya. I want to check the room and see if we have any questions here. Please.
So you said there's this concern that Vladimir Putin is, if Ukrainian scholars reject, they say, oh, he was actually not a pure Ukrainian writer, he didn't write in that language, then Putin will use that to say, oh, see, they don't accept Russian speakers in Ukraine, they're oppressing them, marginalizing them culturally. What is the solution? I mean, you said that that is a problem. There's a huge divide between like a cultural world, literary, and borders, the world of warfare and everything. So can Ukrainian scholars just speak honestly about how he was influenced by Ukrainian roots and folklore and everything, but then also did a lot of writing in Russia without worrying that Putin would say they're anti-Russian? I mean, does that really affect like analyzing centuries old writers and their influences? Does that really affect the modern borders?
So I was talking about Russophone literature created by Ukrainian writers, right? And this became nowadays a political decision for many writers to publish Russian. So before the war, it was not a problem to find a publisher to publish Russian works. Kurkov, Alexei Nikitin, and many other, Khersonsky, they would just publish the copy of the collected volume or a novel in Russian. Nowadays, they either produce simultaneously two versions of the text in Russian and Ukrainian translation, just to claim that they are not associated with Russian cultural public sphere. So just recognizing that we have our own tradition of Russian language literature as part of Ukrainian culture. So language is much narrower phenomenon than culture, right? So a lot of Irish works were written in English, but we still call them Irish literature. We call Mark Twain American writer. Nobody. So, like, why we cannot recognize this as a part of Ukrainian cultural tradition? The works written by Russophone writers. So this is I wanted to say that instead of just disregarding them as part of cultural tradition, embrace and give them a certain status within, because the immediate result of disregarding this tradition is the school textbooks and school curriculum, that these writers do not have a place in curriculum. So Gogol is being taught in the course of world literature, and last year they got rid of his Dead Souls. The teaching of Gogol is limited to two Ukrainian tales, both taught in translation. So I understand that during the war it's not a timely problem, but after the war we will have to define the status of Russian language tradition. So I feel like it would just divest Putin of his arguments that we are rejecting Russian literature altogether.
Thank you. Do we have other questions here? I actually want to use my power at the moment to push back a little bit about something you said at the beginning, your answer to my earlier question about where can we look for parallels. Because if we want to theorize post-coloniality in general, and if we want Russophone texts and Ukrainian literature in both Ukrainian and Russian to be part of this conversation, I think we should be making an effort to look for if not comparable, at least useful situations elsewhere. And you brought it up yourself, the Irish and the quote unquote Celtic fringe in Anglophone literature. I mean, these writers in the 18th century, when they were sort of appropriated by English literature, they were all writing in English, right? But kind of they were also self-folklorizing a little bit, and then being appropriated by the English center and assimilated into this sort of English tradition. So I think there will be parallels, I hope, as we sort of think more about post-coloniality in India, for example. But for me, the challenge has been finding scholars of post-colonial traditions who want to think about the kind of the Eastern European, Soviet, post-Soviet experience because they have their own fish to fry and are not so interested in our fish. So I'm really excited about sort of, parallels that other people will find as they read these texts. I mean, I don't just want to talk about Belarusian, Polish, Czech. I think those are definitely the most salient kind of examples, but the somewhat more abstract parallels, I think, will be useful to us in the long run, I hope.
So in order to do this, we need to work on our methodological apparatus. And one of the approaches in that part of the world is just to talk about the Eurasian subject, right? So, but still we need to start with a definition of what was the Eurasia in every single context. Is a Russo-Ukrainian situation, it's all subjected to what is the more dominant historiographical narrative at the moment, right? So it's very clear when we look at the history of translation of Gogol, whether it was happening during when the Galician narrative dominated or the Dnieper historiographic tradition dominated. So that's why it's very difficult to identify the regional, right, elements, because there were like two different processes. One centrifugal, like a desire to create a universal Slavic language, comprehensible. It was coined as Slavyanorusky, Yuzhno-Rusky, and corresponded to the ideas of federalism, right, of Slavs. And the other was opposite, centripetal, just desire to establish their rights to be regionally diverse and different, right? And we still have this in the text like of Odessa writers or Donbass or Petersburg text or Moscow text. So I feel like in each culture there are several simultaneous processes, and I like to historicize things just to look at the particular text in its particular context, rather than, because postcolonial theory starts with generalization, and I don't want to just apply straightforwardly their concepts. So that's why I think Bakhtin is more productive than Baba. In my
Yeah, I would agree. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that this constant tension between the general and the particular becomes very apparent in the Russophone, the Ukrainian case, and it's a very interesting theoretical question. Thank you. I think Olga Mersan has another question. Olga?
Yes, I think, Yulia, you partly answered it. I was just very much interested in the distinction in lexical hybridity and borrowings between lexical borrowings versus calques. But I think you have addressed it partly. It's just interesting how it shapes the mentality of both Gogol himself and his audiences. On the one hand, it allows you to make, imperialist claims like Putin's, that, we're just one nation, that's it. On the other hand, it definitely, on the long run, it's going to be very productive cross-culturally once Russians are out of Ukraine, So I'm very much interested precisely in that aspect of hybridity. You mentioned briefly that it's analogous to what happens to Yiddish, which is a highly hybrid language. But I was wondering if you also somewhat mentioned that it was a significant linguistic component for Gogol. Could you elaborate a little bit on the examples? I know about Korolenko, for example. But for Gogol, I wonder if you can bring up a couple more examples.
The difference between lexical borrowing and calquing.
No, that I understood that you wrote on it, and I was interested in Yiddish. What you had to offer, if Gogol references it, uses it, or it's just analogous to what he does.
So the presence of the foreign other, right? So my examples were mostly from Nevsky Prospect as the presence of German, right?
I see. Good.
And in Yankel's use of interjections for the most part. So I argue that Ukrainian writers, by the fact of more dense living to each other, and my collaborator in translation, Amelia Glazer, uses a wonderful space of fair, yarmark, right? So it just shows that this multilinguality was not something cultured and taught, but it was everyday reality of living close to each other. And unlike, for example, Bulgarian and other writers who mock, and even Dostoevsky in his Записки из мертвого дома, he mocks the presence of Jewish, right, Yiddish other in the Russian discourse. Ukrainian writers used it more playfully, more for the sake of color, ethnic color. Is just to show this multi-vocality of discourse itself without attaching this to a certain speaker, right? So I'm arguing that hybridity is not channeled in the speaker, right? It's a field, right, of different tensions between different idioms.
Yeah, I think it's very beautiful what you're saying. I have a very short follow-up question. I've been working a lot on Nikolai Leskov's Vladычny Sud, where it's extremely prominent in that whole field, especially considering that it's all happening in Kiev and that he was working for the sex. He seems to use it for mockery, but in the end, his narrator uses it for the same purpose as you argue that Gogol and Ukrainian writers do. So I find this very, very fascinatingly productive field. Thank you so much. I just want to thank you.
Thank you, Olga.
Do we have more questions from the room? Thank you, Olga. Graham.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's been so fascinating. And I was curious about something you said when you likened like this producing a better text to producing a better self, which I think like works really well and was very interesting with Bakhtin, specifically the way that identity is unstable and kind of like likening it to revising, I thought was very interesting. But where it seems maybe more obvious the ways that revising creates a better text, I was interested in the way that you were thinking of that as a better self, both in like managing these two kinds of discourses that you're using, or like this in-betweenness between the discourses, and just maybe I'm fixating too much on the better and the value that seems to be assigned to that, but I was curious as what you meant by that.
I skipped so much material. Maybe it's not clear that I was referring to Gogol's magnum opus, Dead Souls, that he envisioned as a kind of text that could reform the society itself. And he never finished because he kept rewriting first volume, and we never saw the completed second volume. So Gogol being completely detached physically, spatially, because he spent 12 years in immigration, and also ideologically because many different parties wanted to recruit him, like Kireevsky and Khomyakov wanted him to confirm his alliance to the Russian idea, and other intellectuals wanted him to confirm his adherence to Western ideas of progress. And that's why Gogol was constantly unsure about his mission as a writer, right? So that's why he kept rewriting instead of writing new texts, because he thought that it would not only fix the social ugly reality, but also his own imperfect, contaminated soul. Yes.
Thank you. Poor Gogol with his contaminated soul. Well, let me just say thank you again so much to Yuliya Ilchuk for this fantastic talk, and I hope can all hang around and continue the conversation. And thank you very much for
Thank
everybody
you.
who's here on Zoom too.